Hello everyone and welcome to this newest edition of Men at Arms. This is Remleiz from 40k Theories.
And this is Fiaura. How's everybody doing? Did you miss me? Or did you just want me to go away?
And today we're going to be looking at the weaponry of the Necrons. So we'll dive right in with looking at Goss weaponry, in particular the Goss Flare. Now, the Goss Flare is the basic weapon of the Necron army, but has the potential, due to its nature, to be able to destroy even the most heavily armoured vehicles and break down enemies at a molecular level. They are magnetically based weapons that break down a target into component molecules layer by layer and attract the molecules back to the gun at incredible speed. This creates the flaying effect and can vaporize the most heavily armoured warrior or blast a hole in a land raider.
So, for those of you who are curious why I'm shaking my head, no, it's because the Goss Flare is a misnomed weapon, meaning it's improperly named. Let me explain. First, let's talk about the concept of gauze versus rail. Gauze weapon uses similar concepts to a coil gun, which is a set of coils around a barrel and uses ferromagnetic accelerant to drive down the barrel. The difference here is that the angle of the magnets combine in a way with a way in which the magnets are used. Gauze guns use the law of magnetic attraction rather than repulsion. Railgun simply flips polarity and uses the law of repulsion to propel a projectile, while gauze weapons use the exact opposite and drag it through the barrel through the laws of attraction using magnetics. However, we must remember also that railguns are at right angles, whereas gauze guns are in a coil-like sphere around the barrel. Now, as much said, Necrons don't use gauze weapons! It's in the name, but it's a complete and utter misnomer. They do not actually fire a solid projectile at all. Instead, they fire an electrified beam of ionic particles, which is why they break things down at a molecular level. What is actually happening is they are firing a form of antimatter that causes the ion particles of the target to flip polarity within themselves, molecule by molecule, until the atoms lose stability and vaporize in an energy heat like death. The drawing back into the gun is actually the energy itself being wrapped into a magnetic field and drawn back in to recharge the weapon. The lightning-like effect you see in, say, video games or artwork or those kind of things is not actually a projectile hitting the target. It's the violent heat death of the atoms in the air itself from the antimatter charge flying through the materium. Since this is, what we would theorize what it looks like would happen when antimatter and matter particles meet each other and are annihilated in heat death. Furthermore, this weapon can only cause the same equivalent destruction as the volume of antimatter put into it. It still has to obey Einstein's principle of energy equals mass times volume squared. It cannot destroy the matter, but rather it can convert the matter to energy, and that is actually how antimatter works. Effectively meaning that each shot ends up with about twice the ammunition, because you have to remember that the antimatter is not destroyed either, but rather converted into heat and energy, which effectively means that every time the gun's fired, it has more ammunition for the next shot. And no, everyone, antimatter does not work the way you think it does. Trust me. 16 hours of research for this episode. Trust me, antimatter does not work the way you think it does.
So, in essence, Goss guns are not Goss guns, in short.
They're not gauze guns, they are antimatter discharge guns designed to retract. They're gauze guns in the way that in which the magnetic coils are used to a degree, because the magnetic coils are used to create the field that attracts the energy to and from the weapon. But they're not actually firing a solid projectile, so they're not in fact a gauze weapon.
I see. Okay then, moving on to the next weapon, we're going to look at the Tesla Carbine, which is one of the various Tesla weapons that are utilised by the Necrons, and these ones are wielded often by the Immortals. They utilise arcs of, quote, living lightning that crackle from one foe to the other after hitting their target, charring flesh and melting armour. And the Tesla bolts feed off the energy released by destruction, and the lightning becomes more furious with every fresh arc.
Now, for clarification for everyone, Tesla weapons use various coils of electricity that then discharge from a massive spherical ball, usually on the end of the weapon. Tesla coils like this are limited by several factors, the first of which is the conductivity of the target and the amount of grounding the target has. If you shoot someone with electricity who's covered in rubber, you aren't going to hurt them. In addition to this, we must remember that electricity delivers a significant amount of heat to the environment, which is generally very bad for ships that have high oxygen concentration for the atmosphere. You know, because having something several hundred degrees hot in an oxygen environment never went horrible for anyone.
Indeed.
Furthermore, I'm not actually going to go over the mathematics of this one, because in the Adeptus Mechanicus episode, we actually went over all of the mathematics of Tesla weapons. We also did this in the Space Marine episode with the, what was it? Cronkite?
Conversion beamer.
Conversion
was the Vulcan?
The Vulcan weapons. The Vulcan weapons that were based on Cronkite technology. Those things.
Oh yes, that's it, yeah.
We went over them in the Space Marine episode, and exactly how much damage a lightning bolt can actually inflict. It would appear in the Warhammer 40k universe, it's very common for people to just harness the power of raw electrical screw you shot at various people. This effectively leads us into the Staff of Light.
Yes, now, the Staff of Light is a weapon used exclusively by Necron overlords and other Necron lords, and almost an exception amongst Necron technology, it doesn't actually utilize Goss weaponry principles, but instead absorbs energy from thin air to release in the form of powerful lightning bolts. The secondary effect of the energy is there's a steep decrease in temperature around the wielder. The cold freezes the limbs of the opponents, mechanical or not, which then shatters when hit by the staff. Later versions sport a fractal-edged blade on top of the staff for increased damage. Furthermore, the staff can actually be further upgraded with certain other upgrades such as Necron tier sigils, which empower the weapon to fire Goss blasts, a full Goss Flare gun embedded into the staff itself, skinning blades to basically rip flesh and slice through armor, reaping blades, which are basically upgrades to the skinning blades, which can actually cut through even tougher armor and even vehicles, war scythe blades, which can slip effortlessly through the most powerful armor, and a Goss Flux Arc, which is basically a huge multi-barreled flux arc projector embedded in the staff.
Okay. So, that's a hell of a lot to take in. Let's break it down one little item at a time, shall we? The Staff of Light has quite a bit of lore to it that causes its power to vary wildly, just like every bit of Necron technology in existence. Sometimes it's capable of destroying an entire Predator tank with but a single hit. Other times it glances off Space Marine armor. Furthermore, it appears to be using a upgunned version of the Tesla Carbine when it fires its concentrated bolts of lightning death at the Necron foes. Attempting to account for this variance, however, is completely insurmountable. Modern-day Tesla coils are nearly 100% predictable in the amount of electrical energy they discharge, both in frequency and the power level of it. However, this weapon appears to have such huge variances in power that I don't quite know how to calculate out its actual destructive capabilities at times, because it's completely unpredictable to the wielder, meaning that, yeah, you have a weapon that, you know, you might point at somebody and they vaporize, and then you might point it at the next guy who's exactly the same mass and has the same amount of armor, and it just creates a light little singe effect that burns his eyebrows off. Further examinations and gathering of data, I can determine the staff has a random electrical charge released at any time, meaning it is not, in fact, creating artificial lightning, but rather it is crafting, in theory now, false lightning. That is to say, it is causing atmospheric events to create lightning. The energy it, quote, absorbs is purely conjecture, in my opinion, because the air does not deliver enough energy by itself to create lightning bolts. This is not how lightning works. It's not energy coalescing in the air. What in fact happens is when the negative charges of various ionized particles in a storm gather together in a certain place until they outweigh the positive ones in the immediate area and cause the positive ones to attract in at such a high rate to counter the negative polarity, they create a lightning effect when they reach the neutral status at such a high rate. Furthermore, As discussed in earlier episodes, lightning is around 27,000 degrees Celsius upon impact. The air around it is at best 25 degrees Celsius, so you can absorb all the heat and energy you want from the air itself. You'll never create a lightning bolt using that, especially at the rate that this staff supposedly creates them. I could see it maybe decreasing the air around it as it creates a miniature storm-like effect without the cloud or precipitation. But as far as actually using that energy to create the lightning bolt, that makes absolutely no sense and is pure bollocks, both from a meteorological standpoint and from a basic Newtonian physics standpoint, as well as knowing how electricity works.
Basically, in essence, it's absorbing mana like it would be in Warcraft or something.
Yes.
Is what it sounds like.
Now, sigils are not... Now, Necron tier sigils. Sigils are not science. I have no method from which to study or interpret these as anything but conjecture on how they work, rather than these symbols are actually meant to do. What I suspect is that the sigils are electrical conduits shaped precisely to create the flux arc needed to cause the ionization of particles within the staff in order to unleash either the antimatter weapon of the Gauss Blast or to unleash the electrical discharge. And are actually being mistaken by Imperium scientists as something completely different. The Goss Flare we just went over. Skinning blades. Similar to monofilament blades to increase close combat effectiveness. Now, for those who don't understand, monofilament blades aren't made of, quote, monofilament. There's no such substance. Instead, they are sharpened using some supercomputer method. Usually for modern monofilament blades, we actually sharpen them with lasers to sharpen the blade tip so it's only one molecule in thickness. This, however, allows it to easily separate molecules and cut through targets, but means that every time you swing the blade, you lose sharpness exponentially as the blade strength at the tip is not strong enough to withstand repeated blows. Reaping blades I could not find a lot of information on, and somehow they're supposed to be better than skinning blades. How do you make a better blade than a monofilament blade? The only thing I can truly theorize here is that they are actually sharpening it to the edge of a quark, which is a theoretical piece of atom that makes up the larger whole. Smaller than a nucleus, proton, or electron, quarks are made up parts of atoms in theory that we theorize actually exist. But considering metallurgy and the theory of practice of shaping swords, monofilament would be the maximum amount of damage you can truly do with an edged weapon. With a blade this sharp, I would literally expect the person to have random accidents of dropping it and looking down and going, oh god, my entire arm is missing. Warscythe blades. Okay, the Necron idea of phasing assumes multiverse theory is a fact and not a theory, which means that there are multiple universes all simultaneously happening with slight differences based upon individual random decisions. The big question I have here is where the fuck are they phasing to? I mean, I don't want to have to take it how it would interact with armor because it doesn't. What this
I would assume in a 40k context it would be phasing in and out of the warp potentially.
In and out of the warp, maybe, but the way it's described, the Necrons have the ability to phase to other places besides the warp. But that's going to be something that I bring up later in more detail. In the meantime, this blade, in fact, causes what's called total molecular displacement. What's happening is it's phasing into an alternate reality temporarily and then phasing back into the reality of the wielder. As it does so, it displaces the molecules in the space it now occupies at a rate of the speed of light. This is why it literally appears to effortlessly pass through armor, because it's not actually interacting with the armor so much as it's basically trying to occupy the same space at the same moment, and the molecules collide at the speed of instantaneum, which is as close to the speed of light as a molecule can possibly achieve. The thing here to remember is that the Warscythe blade phases into something that's actually harder than it will shatter. In this case, the sharpness of the blade doesn't matter. It's not actually cutting or separating the molecules. It's functioning on the concept of displacement by occupying the exact same space. It's basically what would happen is if you were to teleport into someone else. they would literally just explode in all directions for those who are curious what would happen.
Fair enough.
The Hyperphase Sword.
Yes, the Hyperphase Sword is an energy blade utilized by the Necrons which vibrate across dimensions, allowing it to slice through armor and flesh and sever vital organs within, which are most commonly wielded by the Lich Guard.
Now, this weapon doesn't actually use phasing from what I've read. Phasing is molecular displacement through going through dimensions. This is instead folding the space around it. For those who don't understand the concept, space folding is the theory that if we use an alternate dimension, which is how they actually travel in the Warhammer 40k universe through the warp, the alternate dimension allows you to travel from point A to point B at an extremely accelerated rate because it makes the distance between point A and point B 0. In this state, it actually doesn't interact with the armor, but instead comes back in our dimension inside the armor, causing extreme molecular displacement, similar to what the Warscythe blade does. The difference here is the hardness of the Hyperphase Sword. The Hyperphase Sword is so hard, in fact, that when it passes through the alternate reality, it occasionally cuts things inside the alternate reality or the multiverse that it passed through, in addition to cutting through its target. So, I'm not sure what it's made of, but it's more dense than any known metal that I can think of.
What is the densest metal that actually exists?
The current densest metal that exists that we can actually fold into some form of armor or structural integrity is tungsten steel alloy, which is capable of withstanding temperatures nearly that of our sun, and also is completely and utterly able to stop virtually anything. The problem with tungsten steel alloy, about a square foot of it weighs close to half a ton.
But again, since these are being wielded by the Necrons, which are robotically enhanced mechanoids, we don't actually know their true lifting capacity at the moment, do we? So we could speculate they could be strong enough to lift up a weapon that's made of tungsten steel.
If a weapon were to be made of tungsten steel in this way, it would actually only contain roughly 6 cubic inches of actual tungsten steel, which is just under 480 pounds, or 335 kilograms, which is entirely liftable by a machine.
And considering machines obviously don't have to deal with the stamina what organic bodies do, it's actually quite feasible for it to actually use.
They could continue to wield it effectively.